Just having her enter my field of vision is incredibly distressing. And she's infertile too. What's the point of her even being a woman? There's no need for her to be married, so she should just hurry up and leave. As a woman and as a wife, I find her embarrassing and don't want to be associated with her. My husband and I have decided to live happily with my mother-in-law in this house. She's an eyesore, so I want her out. Why do I have to be the one to leave when they were the ones who suggested living together? I wanted to complain, but since I had been thinking about leaving if I could, I decided to move out the very next day. 6 months later, to my surprise, my mother-in-law came to me in a furious rage, blaming me for everything. But in my arms was my newborn baby, and seeing this, my mother-in-law made an outrageous statement and took shocking action. As a result, her life began to take a downward turn. I'm in my late 30s and work as a freelance writer. I started this job as a part-time job in college. I had planned to get a regular job after graduation, but as I started getting more offers from different sources, I decided to make a career out of writing. A few years ago, I married a younger man who was a company employee. He's younger, but we're both in our 30s, so I don't really feel like I married a much younger man. I met my husband through work. Since getting married, my husband has been transferred to a new department and has been incredibly busy every day. I've wanted to support him, so I've scaled back my work a bit. Still, thanks to the work I've done before, our income hasn't suddenly decreased to the point where we're struggling to live. My mother-in-law doesn't understand my job at all. She thinks a job means working outside the house for someone else. Due to the nature of my work, I often carry my smartphone around for gathering information. Even at home, I like to have it with me to take notes whenever something comes up, but my mother-in-law thinks I'm just playing around. Playing games on your phone again, huh? Must be nice, having your husband earn while you indulge in games all day. She's even nagged me about how much I spend on games. There's also been interference in our household chores. Since it's just the two of us, we do laundry every other day, but she insists it should be done daily. She says it's unhygienic and dirty, though we're not wearing the same clothes for days on end. We're not even living with my mother-in-law, but she has reasons for meddling in our life. First, I'm older than my husband. Plus, being in my late 30s, there's not much time left for me to have children. Since my husband is the eldest son, it would be a disgrace to the family if he doesn't have an heir. And all this, according to my mother-in-law, is my fault. She seems to want to annoy and harass me, hoping to make me leave my husband as soon as possible. She was originally opposed to our marriage, and foreseeing this, my husband made it clear from the start that we would not live with his parents. A year after we got married, my father-in-law passed away. He was a healthy man who had never been seriously ill or injured, and he didn't even need to visit the doctor. It was heartbreaking to see how much my mother-in-law was affected by his death. The night before he died, my father-in-law had dinner and drinks as usual before going to bed. But the next morning, when he didn't get up even past noon, my mother-in-law went to wake him and found he wasn't breathing. The cause of death was a stroke, which seemed to have occurred while he was sleeping. After handling the funeral and other related matters, my husband took the lead in settling things down. Then, a discussion about the future took place at my mother-in-law's house. Considering her severe grief, it was suggested that someone should live with her. Naturally, as the eldest son, my husband seemed the most appropriate choice for this. However, my husband knew about the discord between me and my mother-in-law, and that she still hadn't accepted our marriage. He firmly declined the idea of living together, although moving nearby was okay. But I felt uneasy about the whole situation. Knowing my mother-in-law, she would have preferred entering a retirement home rather than living with me. She seemed unusually passive, just going along with others' suggestions. Proposed to my husband that we shouldn't rush the decision and have a discussion first. After returning home, we talked things through thoroughly. My husband repeatedly told me not to be swayed by temporary sympathy. Yet, I couldn't shake off the image of my mother-in-law in deep sorrow and wondered if there was a way to live together peacefully. Finally, we agreed to start living together under the condition that we each have our own separate rooms and respect each other's privacy. Once we began living with my mother-in-law, I immediately experienced her harsh treatment. The treatment I received was incomparable to the meddling my mother-in-law used to do when she would show up at our house. As a full-time homemaker, you shouldn't be cutting corners. Bathroom cleaning means scrubbing everything from the walls to the floor. After that, you need to weed the garden. Oh, and polish all the shoes in the entranceway. It was way too much for me to handle in addition to my work. When I went to the entrance, I found all the shoes from the shoe cabinet lined up. Some deliberately dirted. Hoping to gain some approval from my mother-in-law, I spent time on household chores, cutting into my work hours. To meet work deadlines, I had to reduce my sleep, which led to more mistakes and more criticism from her, calling me slow and clumsy. Twice a month, I had work meetings outside. The location for meetings varies each time, but they are usually held in cafes or hotel lounges. Sometimes I received gifts, like bags, from famous pastry shops. My mother-in-law always expressed her dissatisfaction. A full-time homemaker who doesn't work, squandering her husband's earnings. If you have that much time, you should focus more on your household duties. Even when I said the items weren't bought by me, she didn't believe it. No way someone would give a country-looking old lady like you a gift. She often called me a country-looking old lady, implying that being in my late 30s and not very stylish was a bad thing. Working from home, I admittedly don't wear makeup much and am casual about my clothing, but is it right for my mother-in-law to mock my appearance? If she criticizes me, I have things I'd like to say about her appearance too. My mother-in-law isn't exactly a beauty herself to be commenting on other people's appearances. She looks just like any other woman in her 60s you might see around. Her clothes are always similar, not showing any high sense of fashion. But I've never pointed that out to her. What's with that look? Got something to say? Just so you know, I'm the one who has a complaint here. Apparently, my mother-in-law went through my room when I was away. She began complaining about how I have too many clothes and bags, calling it extravagant. Although I work from home, I occasionally attend dinners and small parties. I'm not oblivious to fashion and maintain at least the basic etiquette. I buy new clothes, bags, and shoes to match, so I'm presentable. My mother-in-law seems to think I'm making inappropriate purchases with my husband's earnings, but in fact, I bought those things with my own money. My mother-in-law has no business criticizing me for that. Really, with your plump figure, you can't pull off such flashy clothes. She said it was embarrassing and told me to be thankful as she was going to dispose of them. This wasn't the first time she'd taken my clothes. I don't know what she does with them. And her constant nagging always ends with criticism about my infertility. She pressures me to leave my husband quickly, blaming it on my age. At first, I endured it, thinking it stemmed from her loneliness and despair after losing my father-in-law. But as months passed, it only got worse, and I found it harder to tolerate her harassment. One day, my brother-in-law's wife came to visit. She's much younger. I remember hearing she's 7 years younger than him. Being in her early 20s, she's naive and my mother-in-law really likes her. She obediently listens to my mother-in-law, their relationship looking like absolute submission to me. Even when she makes mistakes, her charming attitude never angers my mother-in-law. While she calls me a bad wife and blames my age for my poor memory, she excuses my sister-in-law's mistakes as youth and tells her to learn gradually. The difference in how my mother-in-law treats me and my sister-in-law is like night and day. I always tried to finish my household chores in the morning so that I could dedicate my afternoons to work. At first, my mother-in-law and I had a tacit understanding about this arrangement, but once I firmly decided not to do chores past noon. She was infuriated. She complained to my husband, but he said to let me have a few hours in the afternoon to myself, leaving her speechless. I was able to concentrate on my work for a while, but things changed when my brother-in-law's wife started staying over regularly. You can't even have kids, so at least do the housework properly. She kicked and broke my room's sliding door. Oh, it's all your fault. You didn't come out when called. I'm going to tell mother-in-law that you broke it. Soon after, my mother-in-law burst into my room, yelling loudly. Getting plump because you're holed up and not doing chores in the afternoon, how audacious. She grabbed my hair and dragged me out of the room. My elbows and knees were scraped, and clumps of hair came out, leaving me shocked at being treated less than human. When I was too scared to look up at her, she forcefully raised my face. Wife who can't have kids is just a nuisance, so get out now. As she let go of my hand, I stumbled and hit my nose on the corner of a pillar. Then my brother-in-law's wife added insult to injury. My husband and I are going to live with mother-in-law. You're just in the way, so leave. I had been emotionally crushed by their words many times, but now they had resorted to physical force. Despite my best efforts, my mother-in-law never acknowledged them, and I realized she despised me enough to arrange for me to be replaced without my knowledge. Perhaps tired of berating me, or maybe bored by my lack of reaction, they let me go after a few minutes. I had a hard time staying with my mother-in-law and brother-in-law, so I waited in the corner of my room with bated breath for my husband to come home. That evening, despite coming home late from work, my husband immediately noticed something was off with me and seemed to understand what had happened to some extent. I confessed that I initially supported living with his family, but now I had reached my breaking point. I said I wanted to leave, even if it was just me, but he insisted on leaving together. The next day, he took the day off work and we moved out in a hurry. My mother-in-law made a scene, saying there was no need for my husband to leave. But he completely ignored her. We returned to our original house and started a life free from her harassment. In fact, when we moved to my mother-in-law's house, my husband had suggested we keep our own house without selling it. My husband probably foresaw that something like this might happen someday. Shortly after we left, my brother-in-law and his wife started living with her. My husband apparently received several calls from my mother-in-law asking him to leave me and come back, but he continued to ignore them until the calls eventually stopped. About 6 months later, I received a call from my brother-in-law's wife. Initially, I didn't want to get involved and ignored it, thinking it was my mother-in-law's doing. After repeatedly ignoring her calls, I finally checked the voicemail. In a weak voice, she said, "Help me." It didn't seem like an act, and as a human being, I couldn't ignore someone asking for help, so I decided to answer the next time she called. After a pause, when I finally answered my brother-in-law's wife's call, she was incredibly humble and just wanted someone to listen, so I silently heard her out. According to her, my mother-in-law had taken their bank books, cash cards, and bank seals. My brother-in-law was only given a $20 monthly allowance, and she received nothing at all. The reason given was that as a housewife, she didn't need money. My brother-in-law wasn't even given lunch money, living without a midday meal. My mother-in-law strictly managed the grocery budget, and when she tried to make lunch for him, my mother-in-law threatened to deduct it as a debt from his meager allowance. Their personal lives were completely controlled by her, even down to the usage of toilet paper. If it ran out too quickly, she would count the rolls and complain if she deemed it excessive. While my brother-in-law could escape her surveillance when he went out for work, she felt constantly watched, even when outside, causing her significant mental distress. My brother-in-law, who has always been meek and unable to stand up to his mother since childhood, remained the same even as an adult. She cried, describing their life as a living hell, both financially and mentally. Listening to her, I thought my mother-in-law was living the same way, but apparently, that was not the case. My mother-in-law seems to be controlling my brother-in-law and his wife's bank accounts and spending the money as she pleases. While they were struggling, she even indulged in luxurious meals. Moreover, she intends to have them look after her in her old age, pressuring my brother-in-law to work harder and even telling his wife to do piecework if she has time to sleep. Initially, I thought I would just listen, but hearing about their worse-than-imagined situation, I began to feel sympathy for them. However, the pain they caused me through their harassment is still vividly etched in my memory. Normally, I believe in not doing to others what I wouldn't want done to me and doing for others what I would appreciate. Responding to harassment with harassment only perpetuates the cycle. Besides, my brother-in-law's wife was already suffering the consequences of her actions towards me. As I hesitated to speak, she began to explain something about 6 months ago. She harassed me because my mother-in-law, crying, had asked for her help. She called me in tears saying she was living with her eldest son and his wife but suffering from the daughter-in-law's harassment, unable to sleep, fearing she might be driven out. I believed her and took her side. Initially, she felt I deserved it, but seeing my mother-in-law treating me harshly and causing injuries, she became scared. Believing that I would take revenge on her in her absence or attack her in her sleep, she followed my mother-in-law's instructions, now deeply regretting her actions. She endured her current situation, fearing for her life, believing only my husband and I could help her. It's hard to know how much of her story is true over the phone. I might be deceived, but I'd rather be the one deceived than deceive others. Being called naive is better than being called cruel. With that thought, I decided to help my brother-in-law and his wife. I figured they needed financial assistance to move out and start a new life. Waiting for my husband to come home from his busy job, I told him about the call. I then told him that I had decided to provide financial assistance. My husband suggested using our joint savings for the financial assistance, But since I had made the decision without consulting him, I insisted on providing the funds myself and refused to back down. Actually, there was another reason for my insistence on not backing down. It was also because I wanted to prove a point to my mother-in-law, who had constantly ridiculed and belittled me. 3 days later, my brother-in-law and his wife successfully escaped the mother-in-law's house. It happened on a day she was out for her beauty treatments, paid for with their money. The house was dark when she returned. The brother-in-law's wife was not there. The living room had only a letter left behind. On reading that they had left with my help, my mother-in-law was furious. Still furious, my mother-in-law came to our house and confronted me, demanding to know how I had managed to do it. The note she found stated that they were able to leave the mother-in-law's house because they had received financial assistance from me. You couldn't possibly have the money to help others. How much do you intend to trouble my son? You must have borrowed it from some dangerous place, right? If my son ends up being chased by debt collectors, it'll all be your fault. You should divorce him before that happens. It seems my mother-in-law still thinks of me as a reclusive person. Despite remote working being extensively covered in the news a few years ago, she has no understanding of it. I've told you many times, I work diligently. My husband also said that we both work, right? That's why, when we lived with you, we agreed not to interfere with each other's work while in our own rooms. Just a few days ago, I received a payment of royalties from 6 months ago, and I showed her my bank book as proof. The deposit was about $60,000, including royalties and fees for magazine articles. I've published several books and have a decent reputation in my field. My husband and I met when he was assigned as my editor in his early days. Now, he's working in a demanding department of a weekly comic magazine. Even when we went for our marriage introduction, he introduced me as the first author I was in charge of, but my mother-in-law, disliking that I was older, never paid attention, only thinking about driving me out. My mother-in-law was shocked to learn the truth. The amount in my bank account was quite significant, and for her, it seemed like a big opportunity had slipped away. At that moment, a baby's cry could be heard from the back room. She looked puzzled. I went to the back room and returned holding my newborn baby in front of my mother-in-law. Beside me stood my husband, who had been watching the baby in the back. In fact, I discovered I was pregnant around the time we started living with my mother-in-law. When she became physically aggressive towards me, we decided it was too dangerous for our unborn child and moved back to our original home. We chose not to tell her about my pregnancy during our stay there, thinking it would be safer for both mother and child. Since we were leaving, there was no need to inform her, so we left without saying anything. You were supposed to be an old, infertile wife. It was all something Mother decided on her own. But, being known for having a late pregnancy would be embarrassing in the neighborhood. You've always been like that. Believing even the slightest rumor, buying boxes of expensive water that you didn't understand. Remember how much debt Dad incurred because of that. My mother-in-law interrupted my husband, claiming she had forgotten about the past. Then, completely ignoring our feelings, she demanded that we return to her house with the newborn baby. She even said it was a great relief that my brother-in-law and his wife had left. I'll pass, thank you. Are you planning to take over my account next for your extravagant lifestyle? I'm not working to satisfy your personal desires. I agree. Don't show your face here again. I grabbed my mother-in-law's arm and pushed her out. She cried and made a fuss, asking us to reconsider, but when my husband threatened to call the police due to the disturbance, she finally left. She tried several times to persuade us to move back in with her, but I firmly refused, and after calling the police due to her persistence, she never came back. With my husband and brother-in-law no longer available to rely on for money, it seemed she had resorted to using the inheritance left by my father-in-law. As I mentioned before, due to falling for the sales pitch of a neighbor, my mother-in-law impulsively bought expensive water in bulk, depleting much of my father-in-law's inheritance. They had land and a house, which might have been just enough to shelter them from the elements. However, my mother-in-law couldn't stop her luxurious lifestyle and quickly squandered my father-in-law's inheritance. Not satisfied, she continued to accumulate debt by borrowing from credit cards and financial institutions without the means to repay. The debts were so massive that they couldn't be paid off just by working decently, resulting in the loss of the family home that had been in my father-in-law's family for generations. The house, being old, didn't sell for much, so they had to sell the land as well. They managed to pay off the debts, but only a few $1,000s remained. With this money, she rented a shabby apartment and was forced to work hard despite her old age. Having never even held a part-time job and with her nasty disposition, she struggled at work, often isolated and continuously making mistakes. She returns to an apartment where no one is waiting for her. Living a lonely life without even basic appliances like a microwave, eating cold, discounted ready-made meals once a day. Apparently, after being disowned by us, she desperately sought help from my brother-in-law and his wife. Unable to find where they lived, she ambushed my brother-in-law at his workplace, only to be chased away by security guards thinking she was suspicious. Later, I received a call from my brother-in-law's wife, who was very grateful for our assistance in escaping the mother-in-law's house. Since then, we began talking over the phone about various things. I had always thought she was favored by my mother-in-law, but it turned out she too had been a target of harassment until my husband and I got married. While she wasn't controlled to the extent of having her bank book seized, she was constantly interfered with even in trivial matters. Then, my brother-in-law personally visited my husband to express his sincere gratitude, and since then, our families began to have a closer relationship. 3 months later, when my brother-in-law's wife found out she was pregnant, she became even more eager to have a close relationship with me, wanting to hear about my parenting experience. She was very grateful for the advice from someone who has been through it. Hearing this, I suggested to my current editor the idea of writing an essay about my experiences with childbirth and parenting. I received a very positive response, so it looks like I'll be quite busy moving forward. Balancing parenting and work is challenging but enjoyable. My days are very fulfilling. My husband says that while his current department is rewarding and offers good income, he has heard that children grow up quickly, so he has submitted a transfer request to a department that is more understanding of family priorities. These days, I'm constantly reminded of how lucky I am to have such a wonderful husband and family.